So we love the stories that we hear of people who have gone from rags to riches, or where people have achieved success. We love hearing the accounts on TV shows such as American Ninja Warrior of someone who has faced a great hurdle and obstacle and now all of a sudden is in this mighty feat that they've lost all sorts of weight or that they've overcome some physical condition and now they are competing for a great honor on reality TV. We love these shows because there is a sense of people achieving and climbing high, and there's nothing wrong with rejoicing with people in their rejoicing, that people have overcome difficulties and that they have faced hardships and that they have pulled through it. But there can be a sense when we hear the stories of great people that we can become discouraged. We can think of many people, whether it's Oprah Winfrey growing up in Mississippi and facing the disdain of being an African American woman in a society that still was facing racial tensions. We can think of Steve Jobs, who lost his business only to acquire Apple back and to lead it into enormous success. And we love these stories because of how amazing and wonderful it is. But sometimes we can look at our own lives and we can go, what about me? Can I change? I don't have a rags to riches story. I'm not sure that my life will ever amount to this great accomplishment where I felt like I've done something enormously wonderful and great. And so as much as these stories can provide inspiration and hope, they can also be a source of discouragement for people because they feel like, I just cannot change. In the Bible describes God as a God of the weak. In Psalm 68, verse 5, for example, it describes God as the one who is the father to the fatherless, the husband to the widow. He is the defender of the orphan, that he seeks justice for those who are deprived of justice, and that he is a God who is mighty and great, especially towards those who are weak. That God looks to and fro upon the whole earth to see who is helpless and who he can find, he can give strength and assistance and help to. When we come to these stories, though, of rags to riches, it's not typically the story of the Bible of how people change. It's not me pulling myself up by my bootstraps and being so great and so mighty that I've done something marvelous that ought to be written and recorded and that you ought to emulate and follow. In fact, it's so often that we find the case where people are not strong who are helped, who are deprived of justice who find help, people who are weak who receive mercy. And in 2 Samuel 9, we get a beautiful picture of a God who is a God for the weak and the helpless, a God who is for those who are despised and rejected. So let's take a look at 2 Samuel 9. I'm going to read all of the chapter. David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him?" Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Anamiel, at Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I'm your servant." And David said to him, Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. What is it that causes you to change? What is it that allows you to be weak and to allow yourself to be exposed so that you can be changed? The story here of Mephibosheth is not just any story that's a story for us to emulate and to follow and to model, but rather the story of Mephibosheth is, in actual fact, it's an account for us to see the lavish, covenantal love and kindness of our God toward us. And I think that in this passage we really get two things, and throughout 2 Samuel we get two pictures of what God wants us to learn from this passage. The two things are, I'll just say them right out front, they are to remember where we've come from, and the second thing is to revel in extravagant loving kindness. So what does it mean then to remember where we've come from? Look at the opening verses here, where David begins to speak. David has secured his kingdom. David has become king, and while he had been king for a number of years by this point, there had been rivals. Saul's family, in fact, Mephibosheth's uncle, Ishbosheth, had been a rival to the throne. But David's men had been systematically going and realigning how all those political allegiances would work themselves out. And when the political winds were shifting, if you're a smart politician, what do? You get on board the winning train. And so there was a shift in allegiance and a shift in power, and people were realigning themselves with David. And as a result of that, David had been able to secure the entire land of Israel. And when he had been on the throne and he had established his rule, we come to 2 Samuel 9, and in verse 1, he wants to remember a covenant that Jonathan had made to him and him to Jonathan. It's a covenant that had been made probably 15, maybe 20 years earlier. It's recorded for us in 1 Samuel 18, verse 3, where Jonathan covenants with David and he promises to remember him. There's a sense in which Jonathan is giving up his right to the throne because he knows that his father, Saul, had been one who had betrayed the Lord, who had not followed the word of the Lord, and that Jonathan knew that the kingdom was forfeited from Saul's lineage. And as a son of Saul, Jonathan knew that there was no way forward for kingship. So in an act of covenantal love, Jonathan had committed himself in private to David. And he had asked David in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 14 through 17, to remember him, to have mercy on his family. You see, the way that kings often secured their lineage was by the destruction of the previous regime. You get rid of your political opponents because that's how you secure your position, your rule, your land, your authority. And so as David had been secure in his kingship, he now says, I want to remember the covenant promise that I made some 15 years earlier. The normal practice, as I said, was for a king to solidify. We could say it as this. He would have solidification by liquidation or extermination. Whatever he needed to do to secure the throne, that's what he would do, if it meant killing off people. But now David doesn't say, I'm going to continue in that practice. What does David say? I made a promise 15 years earlier, and I am going to remember that promise. Now Mephibosheth, we are not told his name initially. We're told just of a son of Jonathan. And this son of Jonathan becomes this key and central figure in this passage, where in 2 Samuel 9 and 10, the aim that David has is to show his benevolence, his generosity, the loving kindness that he has received in receiving the kingdom, and show loving kindness to others. And as he does that, he calls upon the servants to find out if anyone from the house of Saul is still alive. We find out in verses 2 and 3 that there is someone who's still alive, and we're given a description in the following verses as to who this person is. And there's three ways that he is described. He is described as he is lame, he is crippled in both his feet. He is described as Mephibosheth. He's given a name, and we're told that he lives in Lodabar. Now, we might quickly gloss over most of those details, and often in scholarship that's exactly what's done. But if we slow down for just a minute and we dig in just a little bit into each one of those three things, we discover something that is profound about this person who receives covenantal love and kindness. First, he's lame. In 2 Samuel 4:4, we're told why Mephibosheth is lame. When David had been seeking to secure the kingdom, and as political alliances were reorganizing, there was a fear in the land for Saul's family, and those who were still living from Saul's family decided that they needed to book it and just get out of town. And so the nurse who was caring for this 5-year-old boy, Mephibosheth, took him. And we're not given exactly the details of what went on, but in the moment, as they were fleeing for their lives, afraid that the solidification would result in their liquidification, they flee. And little Mephibosheth, at 5 years old, stumbles and falls in some way, and he becomes crippled in both his feet. He's lame, and he is no longer able to walk as he ought to. But it's interesting that it's not just that Mephibosheth is lame. It's also significant to realize what his name means. Now, there's a little bit of discussion as to what the name Mephibosheth means, but it's very clear what Bosheth means. Bosheth in Hebrew means to be of shame. And for this boy, his name might mean out of shame, or born out of shame, or from the lineage of shame, or literally from the mouth of shame. And this boy who is from the mouth of shame is from a family who was once heirs to the throne, once rulers, once a king. King was his grandfather. He was in line for the throne. He was certainly a prince to be. But in an act of horrendous disobedience to God, his grandfather had surrendered the right to the kingdom, and now he lives as one who is immensely ashamed. We dare not miss what shame is, because if we understand a little bit about what shame is, it will help us to also understand the next part of why he lives in Lodabar. Shame is often associated with guilt, but shame is different than guilt. What guilt says is, I have failed when we have done something wrong. There's a sense of moral culpability. But shame actually goes further, and it embodies the guilt, and it says, I am a failure. That there is a sense of, there's something wrong with me, that I am of no good, that I am of no value. What shame often does then is it cuts us off from other people. And as we're cut off from other people, we isolate ourselves and we separate ourselves because we're we're afraid of our own shame and humiliation. There's something wrong with us. And when there's something wrong with us, we begin to create a space between us and other people, and we begin to look down upon them, and we make judgments, which further alienates us from them. This is exactly what had happened to Mephibosheth. The reason we pick up this language of he lives in Lo-debar is because it's a place that it's often associated with the ghetto, if you would. The word Lo-debar literally means no word or no pasture. There's nothing there. It was the ghetto, and it was across the Jordan, most likely. We don't have the archaeological evidence to know exactly where it was, but it seems that it was outside, across the Jordan, outside of the land of Israel. It was a place where there was no word of the Lord, where he had been separated from the people of God, where in his own failure he lived in the slums. Once a prince, now a pauper. Once a man who had a right in being in line to the throne, now he is cut off. You see, each one of those pieces actually tells us something profound about where Mephibosheth came from. Once part of a ruling family, but lost through the disobedience of his king figure, Saul. Once a man full of privilege and honor, now a person of shame. Once a family that was connected to God, but now which has no word from the Lord. This is not the story of just Mephibosheth. The story of Mephibosheth is actually the story of each one of us. It's the story where we had an ancestor who was a king, who had a place where he ruled. Adam in the garden, but where he disregarded the word of the Lord, and he was sent away and exiled from the very, very place and rule of God. Paul actually instructs us that we ought to remember these types of things. When he speaks to the Ephesians, for example, Paul says to the Gentiles, remember that you Gentiles, that you once were strangers to the covenants of promise and alienated from Israel and all of God's blessings. This is what you once were. You were a people who once were cut off and estranged and far away, aliens, without the promises of God and without hope in the world. And this is the story not just merely of Mephibosheth, it's the story of each one of us. That there is a sense in which, by recalling where we have come from, that we, who are made in the image of God, have fallen far, far short of his glory, and that we have not regarded God in all of his splendor, and that we have not lived according to the word of the Lord, that we have been a people who have been alienated from the very word of God. So as much as we remember where we come from, we don't want to stay there this morning. What really is remarkable is not merely remembering where we have come from, but it is actually reveling in extravagant loving kindness. And this is the second thing that we see, is how we revel in the loving kindness of God. When David says, is there anyone, in verse 1, is there anyone that I can show kindness to from the house of Jonathan? We think of the word kindness and we automatically think, oh, how sweet. You want to be nice to your friend Jonathan. But that's not the sense of kindness here. The sense of kindness that is described here is the sense of covenantal love and of faithfulness. It's that sense in which I remember my word that I spoke and I will keep it. David, having made this covenant with Jonathan, he now wants to keep this word. And this actually becomes the central idea of this passage. Because the concept of covenant, covenantal love and faithfulness, it's described and it's put on display here in verses 1, 3, and 7. Do you see that word kindness? You could circle it in your Bible. And you should circle it in your Bible. You should mark up your Bible because it helps you to remember the important things. I want to show covenantal love and faithfulness. That's what that word kindness is. It's the Hebrew word chesed. It's the sense of being devoted. And so David says, I want to show this covenantal love and kindness to someone who is from the lineage of Jonathan. In our day, though, we've lost the sense of what covenant means. We often have this notion that it's almost like a contract, that it's just merely a piece of paper and it's formalized. It was described in the 1985 movie Out of Africa, where Meryl Streep plays this woman who has lost love and is seeking to find renewed love, and she meets a man played by Robert Redford. And as they fall in love, and as they're sitting on the beach, she is appealing to him to marry her. And Robert Redford, as he plays Dennis in this film, he says to her, "Do you think I'll love you more because of a piece of paper?" That is often the notion of covenantal love in our day. That it's just mere words. It's just a ceremony. It's just something that we're going to spend lots of money at, and we're still going to have the same relationship afterwards. But let me make it abundantly clear that covenant does not regulate the intensity of love. Covenant regulates the security of love. Covenant doesn't regulate the intensity of love. There's no guarantee that covenant is going to cause you to have these warm, fuzzy feelings and to feel like you're just floating on a cloud and always in love. But what covenant love does is it regulates the security of love. It regulates the sense of, you're with me. When I do weddings, it's always so interesting, as I even think of my own wedding every time I do a wedding. Think of the sense of the vows that you make, that I promise to be faithful to you, to have and to hold, for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health, all the days of my life, so help me God. When I got married, I was thinking of for richer, in health, in better. And that's how it is for most couples. A vision, a dream, a hope. You don't expect that there's going to be for poor, in sickness, in difficulty. And yet that's the reality. And what secures love is covenant. It doesn't make the love more intense. It makes the love more secure. And it gives you a sense in which I know that this person is with me through thick or thin, no matter what. There's a couple in our area, and I won't mention them by name. There's a couple in our area that I've gotten to know where I've seen this picture of covenantal love, and it's moved me. When they got married, they made their vows just like we all do when we get married. But it was some years later where he developed ALS. And as he developed ALS, it caused him to decline physically to a place now where he's in a wheelchair. Can't speak, but he communicates by blinking his eyes and having a system with his wife. One of the most beautiful pictures that I've ever seen of covenantal love is this woman wheeling her husband onto the dance floor at a wedding in his wheelchair and dancing around him, being devoted to him. Do you think she thought when she said, in sickness and in health, that that's what it was going to look like? But the security of love is regulated by covenant. And David here says, is there anyone that I can show covenantal love and faithfulness to? And so here comes this picture of covenant love. And as Mephibosheth comes before David, there is this trepidation, and there is this worry and this fear. But in verse 7, David says three things essentially that give a sense of what covenant love looks like. He promises Mephibosheth provision, protection, and position. Look at the first thing that David says in verse 7. And David said to him, "Fear not, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan." The first sense that Mephibosheth receives is this sense of protection, or of provision. Which one is it? Protection. He receives protection. In the protection that he receives, he's thinking, I am not going to be okay. I am going to be slaughtered. I am going to be exterminated like every other king does to his opponents. But what are the first words that come out of David's mouth to Mephibosheth? Don't be afraid. Now, how comforting is that when you think that what you're going to face is extermination? You don't have to be afraid. I'm not here to harm you. I'm not here to kill you. The second thing that David says is this promise of provision. I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father. This becomes a great hope for someone who's come from Lodabar, this ghetto, this person who has once known riches and now is at rags. He's being given all of the land of his ancestor. And in verses 8 and 9, it's fleshed out that this land is to be harvested for the provisions of Mephibosheth and his family and the servants. That Mephibosheth is going to go from rags to riches. But there's not only protection and not only provision, but there is also a sense of position. Look at what David says at the end of verse 7. And you shall eat at my table always. And when we go down a little further, we find that by sitting at the table of the Lord, of his master, Mephibosheth is treated, we are told, as one of the king's own sons. He's treated as one who belongs at the table, who's deserving to be at the table, who has the rightful place to be at the table. Now, since it's Father's Day, this is my way of honoring my dad. This is one of my dad's favorite passages. And when he first preached it, it was in the Philippines when he lived there in 2002. When my dad got up to preach, I had him actually come and preach this passage in my previous church where I pastored. When he got up to preach, he shared the story of one of the dilemmas that he got into while he was preaching. He was preaching into a church where they spoke Tagalog. And in that setting, he had a translator. And as he began to go through, he began to describe how, well, what Mephibosheth was expecting was justice, death. What he was hoping for was mercy, life. This is essentially what Jonathan had asked for. He had asked in 1 Samuel 20, just remember my family. Don't exterminate them. Just covenant with me that you'll remember them. But then my dad went on to describe how what David showed Mephibosheth was grace. And at that moment, the translator stopped and didn't say anything, and he turned to my dad and he said, "Can you explain that?" And in that moment, they had a little dialogue while my dad stood up at the front of this Tagalog congregation, and they had a little conversation in English. You see, in Tagalog, there is no word that specifically describes grace. And because of the lack of a word for grace, the translator said, "You're going to need to help me out because I'm going to have to explain the concept because there's no specific word." Now, isn't that the way it so often is? That we don't know grace. There's no word for it. It lacks in our vocabulary. This protection, this provision, this position of sonship. And so my dad began to describe different scenarios of what grace looked like. Mercy is not getting what you deserve, but grace is getting what you don't deserve. And he tried to flesh out the concepts of the differences between mercy and grace. But sometimes the best way to describe it is not through definitions, but through pictures. Some of my family served in the southern United States. It was still early days of racial tensions being overcome. And as those racial tensions were being worked out, the issue of racism was still very prevalent and real. In the one case, I heard of the account from a family member's church where a white businessman had taken an African-American employee along with him on a business trip. As they had traveled, they had stopped at a hotel, and when they had stopped at the hotel, they had gone in to get 2 rooms. The place was obviously empty. There was barely a car outside. When the business owner asked, "Could I get 2 rooms?" the gentleman behind the counter looked at the African American and then at the businessman, and he said, "I'm sorry, I only have a 1-bed room left." The businessman stopped and he said, "That's all right, we'll go somewhere else. Thank you very much." As they went out of the hotel lobby to get into the vehicle that they were driving, the African-American man said to this business owner, "Listen, this happens all the time. Don't worry about it. I'll just sleep in the van tonight. It's no big deal." But this businessman from the church put his arm around this African-American man and he said, "You're like a son to me. I'll sleep in the van with you if we can't find a place to stay." At this businessman's funeral, there was an open mic time. And as the mic was opened up, this African-American gentleman came up to the microphone and he began to share with the family there. And he began to say, "You have no idea how hard it's been because of the color of my skin and how I've been treated. But I want you to know," as he spoke to the kids of this businessman, "I want you to know how gracious and loving your dad was. It forever changed my outlook on the way that I saw white people. He treated me like his own son, and that forever changed me." And that's precisely what happens to Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth is forever changed. And we know he's forever changed because of what happens later on in 1 Samuel 19. If you flip over just those few chapters to 1 Samuel 19, or 2 Samuel 19, let me set the stage for what's happened. While David has secured the kingdom, as time has gone on, one of his sons, Absalom, has become quite bitter and frustrated. And the kingdom then goes through this period of turmoil where Absalom, David's own son, is trying to grasp hold of the kingdom. There's all sorts of political turmoil, and David has to flee Jerusalem, fleeing for his life out of fear that his own son will kill him. But as he flees Jerusalem and he leaves the city, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, also leaves, and he takes both Mephibosheth's donkey and his own donkey, we're told earlier in chapter 16. And he comes to David, Ziba comes to David, and makes it sound like Mephibosheth has been a traitor. But when David finally secures the kingdom again and Absalom has been dealt with, and as David returns to Jerusalem, he wants to find out about Mephibosheth. And we pick up the story in verse 24. "And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul," he's in the lineage of Saul, "he came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. And when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, 'Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?'" So David knows. He knows the story, the propaganda that Ziba has told him. "Mephibosheth has been questionable in his loyalty to you. Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" Verse 26, "He answered, 'My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go with the king. For your servant is lame. He has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you, for all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I then to cry to the king?" See, Mephibosheth never forgot where he had come from. He always knew that he should have deserved death with all of the other men of Saul. But David came and showed covenantal love and kindness, a faithfulness that forever changed him. It forever changed him so that he could come before the king and he could only recall mercy and grace. Grace is receiving what we don't deserve. And this is not a passage that extols us to be like David so that we would be merciful. Though we should be merciful. But it is a passage that reminds us that we are all Mephibosheth, that we all have fallen, that we all had a kingly figure in our lineage in Adam, and that we are far from the Word of God, but that God in His grace comes to us with covenantal love. And when He comes to us with covenantal love, it is not because we deserve it, but it is because He has called to us. And He has invited us to come, to receive forgiveness of sins, to receive protection from the evil one who would destroy us, and to fellowship with Him all the days of our lives. This was the promise that when the Messiah would come in Isaiah 35, that the lame would walk. If we see it in Isaiah, I'll just turn there to Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6. It says these words, that when the Messiah comes, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame man leap like a deer and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. It was the promise that the prophets had held to, such as Micah, when in Micah chapter 4, it would say something very similar. Micah 4. I need to make sure I have the right verse. Micah 4, verses 6 and 7. "In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away, and those whom I have afflicted, and the lame I will make the remnant, and those who are cast off a strong nation." And when Jesus comes, what does He do? The Messiah comes, and we are told in Matthew 11, that as John sits in prison and he wonders, is Jesus truly the Messiah? Jesus hears these words, and Jesus says in Matthew 11, verse 4, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk." In John 5, a man sitting by the pool who has been unable to walk for 30-some years is there, crippled, waiting, hoping for this mysterious stirring of the water that he might receive a healing. And Jesus comes along in John chapter 5, at the pool of the sheep gate called Bethsaida. Jesus comes to him and says, "Do you want to be healed?" And the man cries, "Yes," and he is healed. You see, when Jesus comes, this Son of David, the greater David, the King, comes, the King of all kings, and He comes to make His blessings flow far as the curse is found. And in this, there is the great promise of a Messiah who overcomes even when you're lame and even when you are full of shame. And how does He overcome? By grace. It's not the story of rags to riches by pulling up your own bootstraps that will cause you to change. It is the story of infinite grace that when you can say, "I am weak, I am Mephibosheth, I am lame, I am from a family of shame, and I live in the ghetto spiritually," that then Jesus, who is the greater David's son, comes along and says, do you want to be healed? Who goes to a cross to take all of your sin and all of your shame so that you can be forgiven and changed forever. And so we can say with David, as David says in Psalm 23, even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall be like Mephibosheth and dwell in the house of the Lord forever.